Tony Blinken told the Wall Street Journal that the United States public policy is to return Russian troops to the pre-February 24th border, which would mean that they're totally out of Ukraine. How realistic is this, and how unwise is it for him to state that as American public policy?
Well, if his intention is to ensure that there can be no negotiations, then he succeeded, because that's unacceptable to the Russians. Perhaps that's the reason he did it.
But is this a realistic public policy of the United States, that any amount any rational amount of force introduced by NATO or United States dollars could have as a realistic goal the removal of all Russian forces to the pre-February 24th border, or to where they were on February 23rd?
It's the impossible dream. We ought to just forget about it. It's an irrelevant statement. It's unworthy of any attention.
Okay. You recently commented to me off air about some comments that President Putin made, which were very, very intriguing. I found them intriguing, and I think the audience will as well, concerning nuclear weapons. What did President Putin say, and how does it interact with American policy with respect to the use of nukes?
Well, as you'll recall, in June, he reiterated the policy that under no circumstances would the Russians employ nuclear weapons unless they were attacked by a power that used nuclear weapons against them.
Right.
What he's done now is he said that he's re-examined this, and there are certain reasons. One is, of course, that Biden renounced essentially the no first use approach of his predecessor, and said that he would now use nuclear weapons against conventional forces, not only against nuclear forces, even if we were not attacked with a nuclear weapon.
Let me stop you right now. How reckless is that?
Well, this is the president of the United States who made these statements and signed this new policy into doctrine. It was very ill-advised. I don't know of anybody in Washington that thinks it's a good idea, but that's what's happened. And since then, we've had lots of loose talk from people about tactical nuclear exchanges and winning limited nuclear wars, this kind of nonsense. But more recently,
so as a result of this policy change, which I don't think was on the front page of the New York Times, but as a result of this policy change, what did President Putin say or do?
Well, let me go one step further. There's one other thing that has occurred that induced him to change his position. We've placed a lot of aircraft in the theater that are capable of delivering nuclear weapons. And I'm sure most of your viewers are aware that we do have nuclear weapons on the ground in Germany. So it's not impossible that we could load nuclear bombs into our weapons, nuclear warheads on cruise missiles. And of course, we have a battle group at sea, a CVBG, aircraft carrier battle group in the Adriatic or somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean that also has nuclear weapons that it can employ. So what he's now said is that we will not simply sit by when we see evidence that the United States or its allies are preparing a first strike against us. In other words, if we detect that you are weaponizing your cruise missiles and aircraft with nuclear weapons, we will no longer sit still and do nothing. We will strike. Of course, that's a very frightening prospect.
That's terrifying.
Because now you're asking, the enemy is, the potential enemy in Russia is saying, we may make the judgment call that you're preparing to nuke us, in which case we will nuke you first.
Colonel, has World War III already started?
No. You have a war between Russia and the United States via a proxy. That's ongoing. And there are Europeans involved with this. Some are enthusiastic, as the Poles, and others are not. No, we're not yet in a state of a global conflict by any stretch of the imagination. But what I just described to you suggests that if we take that step and we signal to the Russians that we're preparing to do something with a nuclear weapon, we are essentially asking for Armageddon.
In a column that you wrote just last week, which is filled with your typical references to history and the failures of American leadership to learn the bitter lessons of history, you have articulated that national strategy, if it exists at all, I'm quoting you precisely, consists of avoiding conflict unless we are attacked and compelled to fight. Is that any longer national strategy, the avoidance of conflict? I mean, you can't even suggest that that's national strategy anymore, especially in light of what Tony Blinken just said to the Wall Street Journal yesterday.
Yes, until the Cold War ended, military power existed first and foremost to deter anyone from attacking us. But we made it very clear that we were not going to start a war. We made that clear repeatedly. Every president since World War II, all through the Cold War, had always said, we will not start a war. And made it very clear to the Russians that we would not attack them unless they attacked us. So we've avoided a number of crises, some of which are known and some of which people know nothing about that way. But that's really no longer the underlying fundamental in our strategy. And this goes back to the decision that we had achieved a monopoly of power. It was somebody called it the monopolar moment. And we became the indispensable nation that could effectively bully anybody, anywhere, anytime to do whatever we wanted them to do. We got away with that for quite a long time. And I think that Russia has now drawn the line in the sand and said, we won't be bullied by you anymore.
When President Biden spoke in Warsaw, I guess it's about 4 or 5 months ago, obviously you were listening, you characterized what he said was hot with emotion and mired in the ideology of moralizing globalism. What's moralizing globalism?
Well, the globalists are convinced of their moral superiority to everyone else, and therefore anyone who disagrees with them, whether it's climate change, open borders, cultural Marxism, whatever it happens to be, is by definition evil and deserves the worst. That's the essence of moralizing globalism. And of course,
they are prepared
by the neocons.
And they are prepared, these neocons are prepared to shed American blood to advance their moralizing globalism. And I guess that underscores precisely what Secretary Blinken said to the Wall Street Journal yesterday.
I think that's a very accurate analysis.
Okay. You also point out, this is a little long, but I have to quote it. At this writing, which was just last week, 540,000 Russian combat forces are assembled in southern Ukraine, western Russia, and Belarus. The numbers continue to grow, but the numbers already include 1,000 rocket artillery systems, thousands of tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, and 5,000 armored vehicles, and 11,000 tanks, hundreds of unmanned fixed-wing attack aircraft, helicopters, and bombers.
Actually, it was 1,500 tanks.
Okay. Then, of course, you said, in the greatest understatement in the modern age, this new force has little in common with the Russian army that intervened months ago on February 24, 2022. Okay, so President Putin is now serious. If he's amassing 540,000 troops plus all this other hardware, is there any way that that America and its whoever else is involved, Poles, etc., can possibly negate or neutralize that?
Well, militarily, no. I don't think there is, but I still think if we were willing to negotiate on the basis of no preconditions, in other words, both sides come together and are willing to talk without demanding or anything. This nonsense of you have to leave Ukraine before we talk to you has to be dropped.
No, that's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. Then I think you could forestall this, or perhaps eliminate the disaster that is staring us in the face, which is the complete destruction of Ukraine, its armed forces, and its government. But I don't know that that's possible. But militarily, no. Right now, they are dispersed in those areas that I just told you. In fact, I found out earlier today that the train massive numbers of trains have carried huge quantities of equipment and military personnel from Russia west into Belarus, Western Russia, and into southern Ukraine. Those have slowed now to almost a trickle. So most of the movement is over. The forces are there, and they'll probably exceed at this stage of the game the 540,000 I pointed to. They may be closer to 600 for all we know. And that has to be, when you start counting these things, that has to be done by a combination of people on the ground, as well as people that have access to space-based or commercial satellites that can see what's there.
Since the last time we spoke, Colonel, the Russians have revealed that a third drone attack occurred within a couple hundred miles of Moscow, and that it emanated from Ukraine, assuming it did emanate from Ukraine. And this drone attack destroyed a Russian fuel depot. U.S. intel is obviously on the ground in Ukraine. I'm going to assume, you correct me if I'm wrong, I know you're a tank commander, not intel, but you certainly know the basics better than anybody. The U.S. intel is not only spying on Russia, it's spying on the Ukrainians. So the U.S. government must have known, I think, forgive me if I'm extrapolating beyond what is rational to the military mind, the U.S. government must have known that those drones were going to be fired. And since they were going to be fired into Russia, I would think somebody at the Pentagon or even the White House ought to have known that, either signed off on it or knowingly looked the other way. Your thoughts on this?
Well, more details are emerging slowly about these actions. The one at Engels Air Force Base was the most serious one, not because it did any damage. It killed some people, but it didn't do any serious damage.
It killed Russians.
But that base is the centerpiece of the, let's put it this way, the airborne nuclear deterrent. So that attracted a lot of attention. The other base is much less important. And I don't know anything about how much damage was done at this fuel storage area. Luckily for the Russians, fuel is the least of their concerns. They're swimming in it. So that's not going to make much difference. There is information that is beginning to emerge that suggests that these drones were not launched from Ukraine. They were launched from within Russia. And what most Americans don't understand is Russia is enormous in size. Its border is not uniformly protected as it was under the Soviet Union. There are vast areas of the Russian border that are open, and you can move into Russia from the Caucasus, from Central Asia, even potentially over the border from Finland, though this doesn't appear to have been the case this time. So it's not impossible that these drones were launched and then small teams of people infiltrated near the targets and provided the last terminal guidance to these aircraft.
Okay, now, well, we know that we know Ukrainian saboteurs are in Russia because we know of the car bomb assassination that occurred almost under Putin's nose a few months ago.
Right. There's something else here. There's a possibility that these drones, which are very large, by the way, these are not small by any means, may have flown where commercial airliners fly. They could have even had transponders on them that conveyed the impression that they were commercial, not military. We just don't know, but that's a distinct possibility. So if they launched them from inside Russia, used commercial airline approaches through the country, that would have masked what they were. And that explains why the integrated air defenses did not pick up on them.
Okay, let's get back to who could have authorized this or known about it.
Well, an awful lot of things happen, Judge, that may or may not reach the president of the United States. I know that's frightening to people, but we need to come to terms with that reality. Okay. You have a national security advisor. There's a special portion of the law in which the president devolves some key responsibilities that he has to his national security advisor that allows the national security advisor to sign off on certain activities. This includes, for instance, internal domestic surveillance. Just because the National Security Agency or the CIA or the FBI or anybody wants to do something that it has an impact on national security, and they may want to do it internally or externally, doesn't mean they can do it. It has to go through
let's get to the drones. Is it more likely than not that somebody in the U.S. would had to have known ahead of time, not necessarily approved, but known of it because of U.S. intel? Hey, Langley, do you know what they're up to? They're in Russia. They have the equipment there. They're flying drones that look like the commercial airlines, and these things are about to blow up a Russian fuel depot, and it's 200 miles from Putin's house. You should know about it. Is such a communication likely?
I think the CIA knows, without a doubt. The National Security Agency knows. That's indisputable. Whether they knew all the details and the people that were guiding these and where they were launched from, that's another matter, but they were definitely involved. Remember that they struck the bridge to, and that was done, we now think, by the SAS, the United Kingdom MI6 armed entity, Special Operations Forces. So we don't know who did this, but were people aware that it was going to happen? Undoubtedly.
Wouldn't Russian intel have known that something was coming at Russia, either from Ukraine or from within Russia?
They may have, but they may not have known, as I said earlier, that they were going to use the commercial airline routes or approaches as cover for these things.
Okay.
They may not have known that. They may have also not known the real destination. Again, if you have a small team on the ground that may be 30, 40, 50, 100 miles from the target, as this thing flies, it's picked up for control by the team on the ground, and the team directs it to its final destination. They may not have had any idea what that was.
All right. Now I want to have a little fun with you. One of
we need to have some fun, Judge.
All right, everybody. What is he going to do?
Pretty upsetting.
One of our regular guests who presents the other side and who a lot of Freedom Watch viewers love to hate is Jack Devine. You probably know of him. Jack spent 40 years in the CIA and at one point was in charge of all American spying on Russia. So American spies in Russia. Here's what he had to say on flawed Russian intel.
People are grossly underestimating the toughness of Ukrainians. When I was in the Afghan program, people underestimated. The Russian analyst in CIA thought Russia was 7 feet, 10 feet tall. People underestimate the grit and pain that people will put themselves through. After you kill family members, cold weather is not going to blind you from fighting the Russians. You don't go into a country and you think you're going to take it over when the people are prepared to die to the first person. That was their number one intelligence failure in the invasion. They really didn't know, despite all the years, who they were fighting. And all their intelligence reports, some of them had their parade uniforms packed with them. Some of them had hotel reservations. They thought this was a cakewalk. How terrible does intelligence have to get?
How bad is Russian intel, or is Jack putting his usual CIA spin on things?
Well, we talked about the opening phase, and President Putin intended several things. First of all, he insisted that they minimize casualties to the civilian population, that they avoid destroying infrastructure, because this was a show of force in the country designed to induce the Ukrainians and Washington to negotiate. He thought that we would be interested in avoiding a major war in Ukraine. He was wrong. Now, as far as underestimating the Ukrainians, that's difficult to say. They used a very small force because they had no intention of conquering Ukraine. This is a big lie. There was never any interest in conquering the country. They wanted the Russian citizens to have full rights before the law. They wanted the two autonomous regions to be treated decently because they were effectively Russians who wanted their own culture, language, and schooling. He wanted the Ukrainians to recognize legitimate Russian control of the Crimea that they'd had since the 1770s. And they wanted Ukraine to be neutral. There was no goal associated with conquering Ukraine. So I don't know where he gets the parade uniforms and hotel reservations. That sounds like a bit much. But he is plugging the line.
Right.
And
Well,
if he wants to be on contract with the CIA from time to time and be paid consulting fees, he'd better plug the line. You can sure as hell bet they're not going to hire me.
That's for sure. Here's another one in which he refers to President Putin as a shrunken or miniature bully. Your friends and colleagues in the intel community in NATO think that Putin will be weakened by this war and maybe pushed out of office.
Forget them. I've written to it in March, and I continue to say that. I think the die was cast the day he walked across the border. They gave him shrinking pills. He became a miniature leader. The bully aspect's gone. The guy gets beat up the way he's getting beat up. Who's he going to scare? You know, and I read it. I'm sticking by it that you don't come back from this. How long is he going to protract it? But we should not fiddle inside his country trying to speed the process. He will take care of it, and his people will, because it will backfire if we get involved.
Well, the one decent thing he said, you'll probably agree, is that we should not fiddle inside his country, although I don't know that his former masters at the CIA will go for that. But does this make any sense to you? Putin is a miniaturized bully?
What have we always done whenever we decided to attack another country? We immediately demonize its leadership. This is a standard playbook. He's simply repeating, what everybody says. I'm surprised he was so easy on Putin. I've heard far, far worse about Putin from all sorts of people. A mafia don, all sorts of terrible things about a criminal and so forth and so on. This is just, once again, part of the standard routine. And I'm sure that's what he's doing. And he's going to stick with that when the Russian troops are all over Ukraine and there is no Ukrainian army and no Ukrainian government. He'll be talking about the revolution that's coming in Moscow.
One more to go, and I want you to listen carefully to the last two words of it.
What has to happen, I think, is we get through the winter and the Russian people look around and say, here we go again. Our economy, and the troops are going, saying, I don't feel like going over there. I don't feel like dying. Have you seen the footage of some of the planes being shot down? I mean, and some of the helicopters, rather. And they're going in and they don't want to fight. They did the same thing in Afghanistan. The Russian soldiers did not want to fight in Afghanistan. They had tremendous defection. You can't win a war. It's very hard to win a war when one side wants to fight and save their country and the other one really doesn't feel like getting involved. So he has a sales job. So I think the trouble really begins for him when he starts to come back. And I think the Russian people are going to start saying, this is Putin's folly.
Putin's folly, Colonel.
I don't know. I think he may be heavily invested in the cannabis industry and is using too much of his favorite product. Let's be frank, Putin has never been more popular. The Russians as a nation are enraged. The only criticism that he's under at home is, why haven't you already crushed these evil people that have done so many terrible things to us and their soldiers? Putin has deliberately minimized, as far as he can, the information about the terrible atrocities committed against captured Russian soldiers because he's afraid of the backlash. In addition to the 300,000 reservists he's mobilized, they've had 80,000 people volunteer to fight. So I don't know what this man's talking about. Again, I think a lot of this is just standard playbook. I don't think the man knows anything about Russians at all.
How long will it take 540,000 Russian troops, well-trained and well-equipped, entering eastern Ukraine to march westward toward Kyiv?
Well, first of all, that assumes that, again, Kiev is an immediate target. I don't think it is. You have three large concentrations. One in the south that can ultimately move north. The Ukrainians down there have been bled white. They're exhausted. They just moved in most of what we refer to as their foreign legion to Bakhmut because they can't get Ukrainian soldiers to attack anymore. They've taken so many casualties. They're so exhausted. So they've got Polish troops with Americans and Brits, some other Europeans in a mix, plus some Romanians, and they're being moved down there with the Ukrainian forces they can scrape together. Again, this is something the Russians welcome. They want more troops to pour into Bakhmut because then they can annihilate them, and that's what will happen. This is a hopeless situation. At some point when the decision is made to attack, and I think this man, Surovikin, has a set of conditions that he wants to be met. Some of those have to do with equipment.
Now, who is he, Colonel? Is he the new Russian commander?
Theater commander. He's the 4-star equivalent, Surovikin. He's the one that was installed late summer, early fall. He's created a unified military command structure. Before he took over, there were several separate entities who were making decisions independently of each other. All of that is over with. He has absolute control over everything. And he is approaching his preparations for this operation much as Field Marshal Montgomery did in 1942 before El Alamein. He is not going to be pushed into attacking any sooner than he thinks he needs to. And he has been using his tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, rocket artillery to systematically annihilate and destroy everything from command and control to the power grid, energy, storage, distribution, transportation infrastructure, you name it. And the Ukrainians are in very bad shape right now. I don't think they can sustain very many more strikes. And actually, millions of Ukrainians are being told by their own government, pack it up, move west, because we can't keep you in these cities. We can't heat the place. We can't protect them. And that's, of course, another positive development, because the Russians would prefer that these places don't have civilians in them. It makes it much easier to conduct operations. So I think you're going to see massive offensives on at least 2 or 3 axes with a couple of 100,000 troops on each one. And we'll see what they do. They're going to cut off the Polish border from Kiev. So there'll be an enormous Russian force between the Polish border and Kiev. Wow. There'll be an enormous Russian force that encircles and cuts off and destroys what's left of the Ukrainian forces in the south. They'll come up from the south.
This is almost a vice or a pincer movement with Kyiv in the middle.
Yeah. The last thing that they'll do is deal with Kyiv. They want to annihilate the Ukrainian army. They talked about denazification for a long time. They're not going to rest until all of these Nazi formations that everyone apologizes for in the West are gone.
Right.
And once they're gone, then they'll turn their attention to Kyiv. Now, there is concern, growing concern in Moscow, that we would be foolish enough to take this 90,000-man coalition of the willing and try to rush into some part of Western Ukraine as the liberator or savior of what's left of Ukraine. And their assumption is that the Russians won't fight them. Well, the Russians obviously don't want a confrontation with us. But depending on how we do this and how far we're willing to go, we could end up losing those troops to enormous military power directed against them. We don't have the replacements. We don't have the fuel. We don't have the repair parts. We don't even have the ammunition anymore because we've given it all to Ukraine. And we're on our own. Poles, a few Romanians, and us. The rest of NATO is not interested in marching eastward into Russia. So it's a dangerous situation. They're aware of it. And that's another reason why they fear that if they do end up in a confrontation with us and they utterly destroy our force on the ground, that we will then turn to the use of nuclear weapons. That's the concern.
Got it. I want to talk to you a little about an interview I did this morning with a fellow named Matthew Van Dyke, who's the founder and head of a group called Sons of Liberty International, which represents itself as being former U.S. military and former U.S. intel physically located in Ukraine and engaged in the business of, I guess they get paid. I never asked him that, but engaged in the business of explaining or training Ukrainian soldiers in the use of American military equipment. Before I run a clip from him, do you know of these groups and are they prevalent in Ukraine?
Well, I know there's several of them. The only one I know that actually has been engaged in any fighting is the so-called Mozart group. And they've apparently taken some rather heavy casualties, and I'm told they are now withdrawing from Ukraine.
I saw the same thing, and I assume that the Mozart group is a play on names, since I believe there's a Russian group called the Wagner group, which is ex-Russian and Eastern European military fighting with the Russians. You know of them, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Are they a sophisticated fighting force? Are they a private militia? What are they?
They are a very sophisticated professional military organization that is essentially for Russian hire. they are used in places and for purposes that the Russian military cannot be involved. And they've done extremely well. I mean, the work they've done around Bakhmut is extraordinarily impressive.
Okay, let me run a clip from Mr. Van Dyke, who's a bit of a sight to behold. This is just a few hours ago from wherever he was in Kyiv.
Okay.
I feel that most people are overly optimistic about how quickly this war will be over. They think that Kharkiv can be repeated, the northern offensive that went so well with the Russians routing. I think that was a one-off. A lot of those units were undermanned and had poor morale at the time, and once one routed, the rest routed. I don't think that'll be repeated. The withdrawal from Kherson was very organized. Ukraine wasn't able to hit them much as they did the withdrawal. It shows that the Russians are planning for the long haul. I'm concerned that Ukraine won't push an offensive strong enough in the winter and give time for Russia to get back on its feet by spring. More conscripts will be brought up. They have time to produce more ammunition. So that's the main concern, that rather than push now when they have all the advantages over the Russians, including warm weather gear and logistics and fuel and so on, that they'll delay too long. And we don't want Russia to get back on its feet.
Now, that's about the most pro-Russian statement he's made in the past year that he's been on with us. He denies that he's changing his mind. He just says he's being realistic about what he observes. The only criticism of Russia that he made was that they don't have clothing to keep them warm in the winter. But obviously, he can't gainsay their manpower and the military force that's about to enter the country. What do you think?
Well, he's not on the battlefield. He's removed from the battlefield. He's on a contract to do quote unquote intelligence work. In all probability, he's going to stick with the narrative that is being developed by the CIA and MI6 in London, which is what I call the Ukrainian victory narrative, except that now he is at least admitted that Ukraine has some difficulties. And I don't see any advantages that he talked about. I haven't figured out what he's talking about there. And obviously, he's not disclosing the horrific losses they've taken. They're up to 15,000 dead a month now. They are dying.
How big is the Ukrainian army, Colonel? Do we know?
Well, it was a few weeks ago about 194,000 effective soldiers. And they've just been taking horrific casualties because of these counterattacks. The Russians
15,000 a month will put them out of business in a year, even if it stays at 15.
Oh, absolutely. There's not much left. In fact, I'm told the opposite of what he's hearing, that there are people saying to the Russian general staff, look, what are you waiting for? They're really falling apart. They're on their last legs. They don't have any fuel. They're running out of ammunition. They've lost a lot of their ammunition storage, and ammo dumps have been destroyed. So look, we're going to continue to hear the narrative until this whole thing folds. Now, as far as when does Russia strike, again, as we mentioned before, when General Surovikin feels that all of the conditions that he's established have been met for the offensive. That could happen anytime. As far as lacking winter clothing, that's a new one. I haven't heard that one yet. That doesn't mean that they're not making more winter clothing. I have no idea. But I think that's a bit of a stretch. The Russians are prepared for the winter.
And when General Surovikin decides to strike, I would imagine it will be massive, maybe even monumental.
Absolutely. This is no holds barred. This is gloves off. When they go for broke, and the whole thing will be designed to end the war. Now, the war may drag on for a couple of months simply because nobody's willing to step up and arrange a ceasefire. That may well happen on the Ukrainian side and with the United States. Again, Washington is never going to admit that it was wrong. It's never going to admit that it's caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, driven millions into exile, all in this silly notion that we could somehow or another weaken Russia. Nothing we can do about that, Judge. But no, when the axe falls, it'll be profound.
Before I get to our next topic, you did comment that Matt Van Dyke was not on the battlefield. Now, he claims to be on the battlefield. I don't know where he was at the moment he he was recording today. He was somewhere in Kyiv, I guess, because in the middle of the recording, he lost power. Couldn't see him. We could hear him. And then about 45 or 50 seconds afterward, power came back on. But he does say that they're in the battlefield and doing training. Why would the Ukrainian military accept training from American volunteers as opposed to American troops out of uniform?
They're desperate. They'll accept whatever anybody offers. As they have cash, thanks to us. We've provided them with lots of cash that they can pay for all sorts of mercenaries, foreigners. They've invited anybody who wants to come and fight to fight. They're desperate, Judge.
Okay.
They're in the end game.
Over the weekend, and you pointed this out to me, and I'm deeply grateful for it, Colonel, as I am for all the work you do on the show, that the Pentagon, through anonymous sources, has acknowledged that it has authorized the Ukrainians to strike using equipment they obtained from the United States into Russia. Now, I don't know why this wasn't a banner headline in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the New York Post and Fox News and CNN and everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, this is reckless and is highly newsworthy. First of all, do you believe it's true? And second, if you believe it's true, how reckless is it?
Well, the only system that I'm aware of that falls into this category, in the non-nuclear category, are the HIMARS missiles. The problem we have with the HIMARS missiles is we've almost run out of them. And of course, the ATACMS, they're the ones that have the greater range as well as accuracy. We can only produce about 250 of these HIMARS missiles in a year. We've tried in the past to ratchet up that production line. Hasn't worked very well. This is a very complex missile, and it takes hours of painstaking assembly. It's not something you hand to a robot. Let's put it that way, and they put it together. So if we say 10 to 13 missiles a month over the next 12 months, I rather suspect this war will be over before anything substantial arrives. Secondly, if they do have some ATACMS on hand now, this is the Army's tactical missile system, which reaches out 150, 200 plus miles. If they do, and they have been told they can go ahead and use this against the Russians, what do they use it against? Point targets, one or two here or there, 100 miles inside Russia. And what is that likely to do to change the outcome of the war? I don't think it'll do anything. What it will do, of course, is strengthen the view that the border with Poland must be cut off from Ukraine. And that's why I'm a little surprised that we're being so enthusiastic about encouraging the Ukrainians to do this, because that would tell me that there are a couple of 100,000 troops up in Belarus. Get ready. You're going to go south and you're going to cut this border off once and for all. I think it becomes more important now than it has ever been before.
All right. Tell me what you mean by cut the border off. I mean, it's a common border between Ukraine and Poland. Do you mean preventing whatever troops are west of the border from going east?
No, I'm talking about whatever shows up in Poland in terms of equipment or mercenaries, volunteers or something.
Or Americans.
From crossing the border into Ukraine. So if you're a Russian commander, you look at the map, you say, I want to cut it off. And as I think we discussed the last time, there's a line that you can draw from the straight south from the Belarusian border to Zhytomyr, and from Zhytomyr over to Vinnytsia, and from there over to Moldova. Essentially a straight line, and then one line that goes to Moldova. You have just disrupted any further supply to Ukrainian forces from Poland. Now, could they move closer to the Polish border? Of course they could. But I think they'll probably want to keep some distance from it just to avoid an unwanted confrontation with us.
How does American equipment physically get onto Ukrainian soil? Through Poland?
Yes, most of it comes through Poland. There's evidence that some other things have come from Romania, potentially through Slovakia and Moldova, but not much. The main spring is really Poland. And you have rail and roads there that are in good shape that can move this equipment a good distance, after which it's offloaded, placed on trucks, or simply driven forward into eastern Ukraine.
If we're allowing the Ukrainians to use whatever equipment they have from whatever source they get it, and I suppose there's no way to stop them from using non-American weapons however they want, but if we're looking the other way or saying, go ahead, aim at Moscow, what's to prevent the general from aiming at American equipment in storage facilities in Poland?
Well, he's been told not to do that. They have orders under no circumstances to confront us unless we attack them. I mean, Mr. Putin from the beginning has made it very clear he's not interested in widening this war. The only way the war is widened is if we do it. So there's no danger of a confrontation unless we press the envelope. So the bottom line is this is dangerous, though, because at some point there's a potential for that confrontation as the Russian troops move into Ukraine, into the western side, to cut off the movement from Poland. There's always a danger that somebody knocks into someone else somewhere in western Ukraine.
All right. So a Russian fuel depot 150 miles outside of Moscow explodes tomorrow morning. 25 Russians are killed, and I don't know how many millions of dollars worth of fuel is lost. They have plenty of fuel, but still this is a loss. And they're picking through the rubble and they see Made in USA on it. What does Putin do? Overtly or covertly to respond to this?
Well, Judge, two things. First of all, he already knows this. He knows what we're doing. It's not a secret. If anything, we've sent a signal to the Russians that, frankly, we don't care what they do or what they offer. We are not going to cooperate and negotiate an end to this war. I mean, that's the conclusion that the Russians have reached. The only way this war ends is if they end it on the ground in Ukraine. That's why the offensives are inevitable. And we've shown no interest whatsoever in any other kind of approach. The second thing is the Russians have many, many ways to escalate against us horizontally. Now, what do I mean by that? Look at our open border to the south. Look at the Caribbean basin. Look at Mexico, which has a long history of cooperating with the Russians when they were the Soviet Union, and before that with the Germans against us. Look at Venezuela. Look at the small states of Latin America. Their borders are porous. Organized crime is everywhere. The Russians have the opportunity to intervene there and provide people with arms that can be used against us, with drugs that can be used against us, with diseases that could be used against us. We just go down the list. It's almost endless. It's really a menu. Just how much damage does someone want to do to us since our southern border is completely open? It's easy.
So who and at what level in the American government would have made the decision to authorize strikes into Russia using American equipment? Would this have come from Langley? Would this have come from the Pentagon? Would this have come from the White House?
Well, the decision ultimately would pass across the desk of the National Security Advisor, Mr. Sullivan, and he would either recommend approval or not. So I suspect that that's where you have to begin your search to discover who's ultimately behind it. But remember that all of the people that are at the top of these bureaucracies have signed on for this unconditionally. If anyone knows how utterly foolish, stupid, and dangerous this is, it's Ambassador Burns, who previously was ambassador in Russia.
This is the director of the CIA.
Yes. And how much pushback is he mounting against these dumb decisions? Has he stood up, much as Milley did a couple of weeks ago, and said, I think the Ukrainians have done all they can reasonably do. This is a good time to negotiate. Well, when you're dying in Ukraine 139 times faster than American soldiers died in Vietnam, it seems like it's a good idea to slow down and negotiate, does it not?
Right.
So
would
obviously decided they don't care.
Would anyone have offered to Jake Sullivan or Lloyd Austin or Tony Blinken or even the president the type of consequences that you've just offered to us, consequences that might be instigated by the Russians to retaliate for the use of American equipment invading their territorial sovereignty? I mean, when you think about it, American military equipment invading Russian sovereignty, over something that doesn't affect the national security of the United States, Colonel. It's mind-boggling.
Well, if we're concerned about that sort of thing, we'd be concerned about the dollar as the world reserve currency. We'd be concerned about our $31 trillion mounting sovereign national debt. We'd be concerned about the Chinese, the Japanese, and others dumping U.S. treasuries. I mean, there's a whole list of concerns that you can go through before you get to the one that I mentioned. I'm just saying that for the Russians, they can horizontally escalate. They can do things to us over which we have very little control because we have imposed this open border business on us. We're not adequately protecting our littoral waters. We're treating everybody who shows up here as a valid refugee for all intents and purposes. We don't know anything about the people. I mean, we could go on and on. I mean, we wouldn't know if there are Russian cruise missiles sitting somewhere in northern Mexico near Guadalajara that have been given to the drug cartels for their use at the proper time. This is a Pandora's box that is open. And what do you do when something really bad like that happens? Well, it's too late.
All right. So as I hear what you're saying, and I don't mean to be personally critical of Jake Sullivan, but his last job in the government before the one he has now was chief of staff to Mrs. Clinton when she was Secretary of State. A political decision, not a smart intel decision, is what produced this, okay, you can go ahead and bomb Russian territory. That the intel community, knowing what could come north from Mexico or anywhere south of Texas, would have argued fiercely against it.
Yeah, but again, it's poor strategic thinking because as far as I can tell, there is no strategy. Did anyone bother to tell the American people or anyone else when this ends, this war, we know what we would like Eastern Europe to look like? The only thing we've heard is we want Putin removed and we may dismember Russia so that it can no longer threaten anyone. That's a hell of an end state. It doesn't offer much to the Russians, and there's no reason why they should pay any attention to us. I think this is the biggest problem right now. People on the Hill don't understand that this is not a banana republic. This is Russia. It's a great power. They're not going to simply say, oh, I'm so sorry. Please let us withdraw our forces and let's have a negotiation.
Right. How large is the force and what is their level of training as we understand it? That is about to enter or is ready to enter Ukraine from Russia?
Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is a very poorly trained or almost untrained force, and 10 is the best you're ever going to see, I think it's probably close to an 8 at this point across the boards. They're training very hard. I watched some video footage recently of infantry assaults mounted by the Russians against the Ukrainians in Bakhmut, and the Russian assaults were devastating. The infantry was very well trained. They took no losses, and they utterly annihilated the Ukrainians that they were fighting. And the Ukrainians were not trained. And that's the biggest problem right now. Most of these Ukrainians are being forced into this. They don't have adequate training. 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks in the UK, and you're back and you're in the trench. Are you kidding me? What are you normally? I'm a shopkeeper, a farmer. This is ridiculous. And
Did you say 5 weeks in the Did you say 5 weeks in the UK?
Yeah, well, we have
are being trained in England.
Some of them are, and some of them have been trained in Germany. Some of them have been trained, I'm told, in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. This is the most that most European countries will offer at this stage, and I'm not even sure how much longer that will last.
All right, you estimated the level of training from 1 to 10, 10 the best, 1 the worst, at being around an 8. How large is this assault group that's going to be available to the general any day now?
Well, remember, I think a few weeks ago, I published an article and said they'd accounted for about 540,000 men.
Right.
And of that number, let's say 450,000 are ready to go right now. And another 150,000 will be ready to go by the end of December. It's entirely up to Surovikin. And that's why I'm a little concerned about this business of, sure, by all means, if you can reach a target 100 miles from Moscow, go for it. Under those circumstances, I think Surovikin is going to say, well, the first thing we need to do before we do anything else is cut off the border with Poland. Make sure nothing else comes across, in
Right.
which case you get that assault out of Belarus right away. And judging from the conditions of Ukrainian forces in Donbass, I don't think it would be very hard for the Russians to launch down there as well and overwhelm them. But again, I don't know what's in the mind of Surovikin. I don't know what the current guidance is. It's just that we're not doing anything that makes sense if your aim is to save as much of Ukraine as possible.
What is the best that President Zelensky can hope for, short of a miracle?
Oh, he has no hope of much of anything except maybe escaping to Poland, at least temporarily, when the time comes. If he waits until the Russians attack from the north into central Ukraine, west of Kyiv and east of the Polish border, I'd say his goose is probably cooked.